wonder if you could talk a little bit about the findings that you discussed from William Polk. You talk about his book, Violent Politics, and you also talk about his essay, Falling into the ISIS Trap, and point to some conclusions that he draws that haven't been given the attention.
Polk is an extremely interesting person. He's a fine Middle East scholar and general historian, very distinguished. Also, he has a long history at the top level of U.S. government planning. On the National Security Council, he's one of the leading figures for years in planning about the Middle East and elsewhere. And he's the book that you mentioned is actually a book about insurgencies, beginning with the American Revolution, which he just describes as an insurgency, not a revolution. And he points out accurately that the U.S. War, what we call the War of Independence, was won by terrorists, people we would now call terrorists, independent militias carrying out terrorist acts. George Washington did try to construct an elite-style army on the British model, which was defeated all the time. It would have lost the war if it hadn't been for the guerrilla forces with many terrorist acts. And of course France, which intervened. Our War of Independence was part of a global war between the major powers of the day, France and England. France intervened and saved the situation for the insurgency. And he points out that there's a pattern that runs through history, which is that foreign powers that intervene set off a regular dynamic. Maybe at first they're accepted, but their very presence causes actions which lead to protest, which they then put down by force, setting off a dynamic of greater protest. And finally, the war becomes a political, a national war, at which the outside power always eventually loses, unless they destroy the society. And this is a pattern that runs all the way through from, in his review of the American insurgency up to the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he then, in this other article which I mentioned and elsewhere, it does discuss the ISIS phenomenon and the ways of sensibly dealing with it. And what he points out, and here I should say he has, I think, almost total agreement from every other specialist who's paid attention, serious attention to the sources of the ISIS jihadi phenomenon, ISIS in particular. So Scott Atran, he and his group have done extensive research on the topic, others have. They all reach about the same conclusion. ISIS is a total monstrosity, nobody questions that. But there are reasons for its existence. If you hit it again with a sledgehammer, if that's your reaction, you'll create something worse. That's happened repeatedly. Also in the book, talk about Andrew Coburn's history of efforts to kill the people you hate, drug cartel leaders, what we call terrorists. Every time you kill one of them, the leader, what happens is he's replaced by somebody younger, more militant, more violent, and more murderous. And that's happened over and over. It's recognized by U.S. government terrorist specialists who warn against the attempt to kill the leader of ISIS, which they say, Bruce Hoffman, will just lead to something worse. As long as you don't pay attention to the reasons, the sources, and the background, just smashing it with your sledgehammer is a way of making things worse. That's been shown over and over. In very recent history, it's Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, the so-called War on Terror. Just take a look at the War on Terror, so-called. It was launched 2001. The terrorist forces were located in a small tribal area, a remote area in Afghanistan. That's where Al-Qaeda was. And where are they now? All over the world. Every time you smash them up, it expands. The invasion of Iraq alone led to a 7-fold increase increase in terror in the first year. Been kind of predicted by intelligence agencies, but went beyond. And that just continues. It's kind of so transparent right in front of us that it takes genius not to see it. But Polk does give a considered, careful analysis, and he points out that if you want to deal with the ISIS monstrosity, you have to face facts, not illusions. One fact is that it does have reluctant but meaningful support from the Sunni populations of the region, which regard it as at least some defense against enemies that they fear even more. You have to face the fact that the young jihadis who are flocking to ISIS from Western Europe and elsewhere have reasons. And the reasons are not that they read the Hadith and the Quran. Most of them have very limited Islamic background. They may pick this up as an ideology, but that's not the source. The source is their lives. They're living in conditions of degradation, repression, humiliation, no options, hated by the environment in which they survive. And young people want something. They want some dignity. They want some opportunities. And this offers them the ideal of maybe we'll construct an Islamic utopia, so it draws them to it. If you want to undermine the sources of ISIS recruitment, you have to face that fact. You have to ask what's happening in the banlieue of the suburbs around Paris, where these North African other immigrants are trying to survive. And Pope does discuss this. Scott Atran and others have also discussed it. Even the Obama administration kind of backhandedly recognizes it. That's the only way to deal with the problem. To deal with the problem by just smashing it up further is just going to spread the terror and violence that's been happening for the last 15 years.